Good day, Grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's Life Sciences lesson. My name is Fauzi Rahman, and this lesson is brought to you by Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Saibono Discovery Center and broadcast by Pakama Research and Development. This afternoon, we are continuing with the human nervous system, and we are going to learn about another amazing organ called the ear. I'm going to tell you about the structure and the functions of the ear, and my colleague Radine will explain how the ear functions, and she'll tell you about the defects of the ear. Right, let's get started. The first thing you do is when you start any section is you look at this important document which you should all have as grade 12 learners called the exam guidelines. The exam guidelines tells us what you need to learn and what could be tested in the exam. If it's not in the exam guidelines, then we cannot test you on it. Right, so we're starting with the ear. Let's see what we need to learn for the ear and what could be tested in the exam. The first part is the structure of the human ear and the functions of the different parts using a diagram. Then we're going to look at functioning of the human ear in hearing, the role of the organ of Corti without details of the structure. So you just need to know which organ and the receptor. Balancing, including the role of the maculae and cristae without details of their structure. And then the cause and the treatment of the following hearing defects: middle ear infections, the use of grommets, and deafness, the use of hearing aids and cochlear implants. Right, the structure of the ear. Firstly, the ear is made up of three regions. We have the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. Right, let's look at each part. The outer ear. The outer ear is made up of the pinna. The pinna is this cartilage tissue that traps sound waves and directs it through the auditory canal to the tympanic membrane. And the pinna is sometimes, like for example, elephants, which have a large pinna. Dogs have a larger pinna than humans. They all hear better than us. If you take your hand and you put it around your pinna, you may find that you can hear slightly louder than normal because it's trapping the sound waves that are being directed here and channeling it through the auditory canal to the tympanic membrane. Now, the tympanic membrane, right, receives these sound waves and transfers the waves to the bones of the middle ear. Now, the auditory canal has cerumen glands or wax glands, and and it secretes or produces wax. The function of the wax is to trap dust particles, any foreign bodies that may enter the ear, to prevent it from going into the eardrum, which is a very, very delicate organ. Now, it says the structure and function of the outer ear, which is air-filled. Remember, the outer ear is air-filled. That means it has air only. And the tympanic membrane, which we've spoken about there. The middle ear. Structure and function of the middle ear, and the middle ear is also air-filled. So let's look at the middle ear. The middle ear starts off with
You have been given power to decide whether you want good results in your life, in your schoolwork, or you want bad results. As Tony Robbins said, it is in the moment of your decision that your destiny is shaped. And your destiny is shaped right now with the decisions that you are currently making in your schoolwork. So decide whether you want to be an A student and start working on it, because there is power inside of you. The infinite power is inside of you, and the time you decide to tap in that power, you will become who you want to become in your schoolwork. Believe in yourself. Believe a little more in yourself, because to those that believe, nothing is impossible. You have done this before. You have passed your tests before. You have went into a higher grade before. It is possible because you have done it before. Do not doubt yourself. Keep believing in yourself. Keep pushing because this can be done and you can be great. You have been given power to decide whether you want good results in your life, in your schoolwork, or you want bad results. As Tony Robbins said, it is in the moment of your decision that your destiny is shaped. And your destiny is shaped right now with the decisions that you are currently making in your schoolwork. So decide whether you want to be an A student and start working on it, because there is power inside of you. The infinite power is inside of you, and the time you decide to tap in that power, you will become who you want to become in your schoolwork.
Right, welcome back. Sorry about that. Right, we were looking at the structure of the ear. I said the ear consists of three regions: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. So if you look at the diagram, the outer ear is the pink portion, the pinna, the auditory canal, and the tympanic membrane. And then part of the yellow region here, you're going to find that is the middle ear. And the inner ear is made up of these three canals and the snail-like structure called the cochlea. Right, the outer ear. We are looking at the outer ear structure and function. The pinna, as I said earlier, is a cartilaginous structure. It traps sound waves and directs it through the auditory canal to the tympanic membrane. Now, the tympanic membrane then transfers these waves to the bones in the middle ear. So the auditory canal has cerumen glands or wax glands that secrete wax. This wax is important because it traps dust particles, it traps any foreign objects, insects that may enter the ear, because the tympanic membrane is very, very sensitive. Right, now the middle ear. The middle ear is also air-filled. The middle ear is made up of three tiny, tiny bones called the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. So they are named according to their shape. We use the words malleus, incus, and stapes because that is the Latin words, right? The hammer, the first one, the hammer, here looks like a bit of a hammer, right? Then we have the anvil, which is the structure here where you forge metal. And the last one is the stirrup. The stirrup is the structure here, right? Where you put your foot in when you go horse riding. And this part here is an important part I want you to take note of. That's called the foot plate, where the foot enters into the stirrup. Now, there's the stirrup here, right? And there's the foot plate there, okay? Now, these tiny bones are called ossicles. And in the exam, when you speak about the ossicles, you're talking about the three tiny bones. So you can say hammer, anvil, stirrup. You can say malleus, incus, stapes, or you could say ossicles. But there's an important point I need you to remember. If you are using the words hammer, anvil, and stirrup, it must be in that order. Do not mix the order, right? So you say ossicles, or you say the words in the order that they are found from the outer ear to the inner ear. Now, these ossicles, what is their function? They amplify and transmit the vibrations from the tympanic membrane through to the oval window. Now, the oval window sits here. So the stirrup lies on the oval window. The foot plate of the stirrup lies on the oval window. Remember, the oval window is a membrane, right? We call it a window, but it is a membrane. And that is where the stirrup sits, okay? So it amplifies and transmits the vibrations to that oval window. Now, let's talk about the amplification of sound. So the tympanic membrane is this large membrane that is here, right? And as you go along, you find the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup here, or the malleus incus and the stapes, the area of the tympanic membrane is much larger than the area of the stapes and the oval window. So you can see here, we have the tympanic membrane, then we have a slightly smaller malleus, a slightly smaller incus, and then a small stapes. And the foot plate of it is here, right? The membrane, where it lies against the membrane. So the ossicles are decreasing in size from the hammer, the anvil to the stirrup. Therefore, sound is amplified approximately 20 times in the middle ear. That's pretty amazing. Right, the middle ear, again, remember, it is air-filled, but now we're looking at this tube here called the eustachian tube, right? This eustachian tube connects the middle ear with the throat, right, with the throat. Excess fluid from the middle ear drains into the throat. And the eustachian tube equalizes pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane. So it's going to equalize pressure on this side and this side, on either side of this tympanic membrane. Okay? Right. Now let's look at the eustachian tube. So when you go scuba diving, for example, right, the higher the water pressure becomes, so the deeper down that you dive, the higher the water pressure becomes. Water exerts pressure on the tympanic membrane. So water is exerting pressure on this tympanic membrane, and the pressure on the tympanic membrane from the auditory canal is much higher than in the middle ear. So let me show you that the pressure inside the auditory canal is higher than the pressure in the middle ear. So you have to close your nose and blow in this way to allow air to go into the eustachian tube and into the middle ear and equalize the pressure on both sides. Right? So in that way, the air pressure is equalized on both sides of the tympanic membrane. So it's very important to understand that your eustachian tube needs to be open and air-filled, free-flowing. Right, now we're still looking at the eustachian tube because these are the possible questions you can get in the exam relating to the eustachian tube. So they talk about these scuba diving, skydiving. So let's talk about this. The higher up you go, now it's different, the lesser the air pressure becomes. So the higher the altitude, the less the air pressure. Pressure in the auditory canal now becomes less than the pressure inside the middle ear. And the tympanic membrane experiences pressure from the side of the middle ear. So air must leave the middle ear via the eustachian tube to equalize the pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane, right? So sometimes when you open your mouth or you yawn, then that seems to help to equalize the pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane. So this happens when you find a difference in altitude. When you're traveling from Johannesburg to Durban or Durban to Johannesburg, you'll find that your ears are clogged, and that is because of the air pressure, the inequality in the air pressure. And if you open your mouth and wide or chew some gum, it always comes right. Right, we're now looking at the structure and function of the inner ear. Now, if you look at the inner ear, it is fluid-filled. Outer ear, middle ear is air-filled. The inner ear is fluid-filled. It is a bony structure, guys. It's a bony structure filled with liquid. And it consists of this window called the oval window here. Remember, the stapes is lying against it. The foot plate of the stapes is lying against it. And these three semicircular canals. Now, the semicircular canals lie in 90 degrees to each other in one of each plane, that is your X, Y, or your Z plane. And they are tubes that are filled with liquid. At the bottom of these tubes, you find a little rounding, a little bubble here, this part here, right? That is called an ampulla. Ampulla for one, ampullae for plural. That's a rounding at the bottom of each and every semicircular canal. It contains a receptor called cristae, which is necessary for balance. Then we look at this area between the three semicircular canals here and between the cochlea here. We have the structure here called the utriculus, and we have this structure here called the sacculus, right? They have an important structure called maculae in them. And that maculae is also a receptor for monitoring the position of the head in relation to the ground. Right, now we have this structure here called the cochlea. The cochlea looks like a snail. The cochlea actually means snail in Latin. It's a Latin word for snail. So it's a snail-like structure filled with fluid, and it has an important receptor called the organ of Corti. The organ of Corti is stimulated by movement of fluid, and that converts stimuli into impulses, right? So these are important words for you to know when it is a stimulus, when it is an impulse, and this is the inner ear, and it is fluid filled. Right, we're still in the looking at the inner ear, and now we're looking at the little structure here below the oval window. So that is the oval window, the small window, and remember that has the footplate of the stapes against it. Now we have a window here called the round window. This is also a membrane, right? The tympanic membrane, the oval window, the round window are membranes. This releases pressure created by the oval window in the fluid, and it prevents echoes by the distortion of pressure waves in the liquid. So there's pressure waves created in the cochlea, and the round window absorbs that and prevents echoes. So you hear a clear crystal voice. You don't hear an echo when you are listening to something. Now we come to this part here called the auditory nerve, right? The auditory nerve contains two nerves that join to form one, okay? Now, you do not need to know the various names, the vestibular branch. All you need to know as it is in the exam guidelines, it says auditory nerve. So you will speak of both this one and this one as both the branches as the auditory nerve, and this transmits impulses to the brain, right? And you have to mention which part of the brain, depending on hearing or balancing, which Radine will talk to you about. Now, when you look at Mind the Gap, at the back of Mind the Gap, there are annexures. And you will find that there are diagrams on page 129. You will find these same three diagrams. You must label these diagrams and write the functions. That means you need to annotate these diagrams. You will write the labels in one color and you will write the functions in another color. A picture speaks 1,000 words. So just by looking at the diagram, you'll be able to know what the structure is and what the function is. So those are very, very important for you to go over and to know and to label and to annotate. This is an important slide because you need to know parts of the ear and the receptor, right? Remember we said, according to the exam guidelines, that you do not need to learn the structure of each one, but you need to know the name and where it belongs. So the semicircular canals, they have the ampullae at the bottom, remember, and they have the receptor called the cristae for balancing. Then below, between the semicircular canals and the cochlea, you have the sacculus and the utriculus, and those have the receptors called the maculae. The maculae is responsible for the movement of the head due to gravity. And then you have the cochlea, and this organ is for hearing. It has the receptor called the organ of Corti. So make sure you learn this slide, print it out, because your teachers will get a copy. Right, we're going to now look at an activity. So let's look at the structure of the ear. This is a typical exam question, a typical diagram of the ear that you could get in the exam. And it says give one function of part A. But you can only give the function if you know what part A is. Right, so part A we'll say is the auditory canal, right? And the auditory canal then transmits waves to the tympanic membrane here, or we could say it secretes ear wax, right? That would also be marked correct. Then we're looking now at E, and we've spoken at length about E, right? E goes to the back of the throat. We said it's a tube, and that is called the eustachian tube. What is its function? It equalizes pressure on either side of this membrane here called the tympanic membrane. And then we're speaking about F. Now look at F. We've got the stapes or the stirrup, which I mentioned on numerous occasions that it lies on the foot plate of it lies on the oval window. So that's the oval window there. This is the oval window here, the colored part there. Right, below it is this tiny window here, right? And that is called the round window. What does the round window do? It releases pressure from the inner ear and prevents echoes in the ear. So it absorbs all excess sound. Right, and so let's look and see if we can label the ear. So what you would do in the exam as grade 12s, you're not going to get so many labels. You'll get a few from here. Okay, in grade 12, the maximum may be 2 or 3 labels that you will get for one question. We're not going to give you so many, but because I'm doing the structure, we're going to look at, we're going to label this diagram. So what you would do in the exam, you would write down from A to K or in your informal assessment, and you would label the diagram. So the diagram, the first one, A is the pinna, right? And then this is the pinna, and then we're looking at B. So what do you think B is? Right, I hope you got that one right. B is the tympanic membrane. Okay, then we're looking at C. And remember, C is the semicircular canals lying in 90 degrees in a three-dimensional plane, 90 degrees to each other. That is the semicircular canals. Okay, and remember at the bottom of the semicircular canals, you have the ampulla, which has the cristae. So don't forget that. Right, we're looking at D. D is, we'll say, the auditory nerve. And then we're looking at E, the snail-like structure, which is the cochlea. And then we're looking at F. Now look at F, right? F is this, there's the stapes here. You can see the stirrup or the stapes there. And F is just below it. So if it is below it, it means it's the round window. So F should be the round window. G is this tube that is going down this way here, right? And that is the eustachian tube. Okay. And then we're looking at H. H is pointing to this structure here called the stirrup or the stapes, right? And then we're looking at I, right? H is the stirrup or stapes, I is the incus or anvil, and then you have your J here, which is your hammer. Now, please remember in the exam, if you're mentioning the ossicles, you mention it from the hammer, anvil, and stirrup in that order, or you can use the word ossicles. Right, and the last one is K, which is the auditory canal here. Okay, so we'll do one more activity. Right, so we're looking at activity 2, and we are saying why do people with middle ear infections are usually advised not to travel by airplane. So what the examiners want, they can change the scenario, grade 12 learners. We can talk about scuba diving, we can talk about flying in an aeroplane, we can talk about parachuting, the same thing. So you just need to know what part is being affected. And if that part is being affected and if it's being affected in some negative way, it's not going to be able to perform its function. And therefore, it would cause a problem. So life sciences is logical. You will look at the part, the function, and what it does. So if it cannot perform, if something happens to it, therefore, it cannot perform its function, and it will have a negative effect on whichever part we are speaking about. So let's look at this. The middle ear, right? We are speaking now about the middle ear, and remember the middle ear is air-filled. So why people who have middle ear infections are not advised to travel by aeroplane? So if you have a middle ear infection, it means that there is fluid in the middle ear, right? It could mean then that there's a build-up of it. and that could lead to the eustachian tube being blocked, your nose blocked. Remember, the ears, nose, and throat, those are all connected. That's why you go to one doctor, the ENT specialist, because these three are all connected to each other, right? And so mucus builds up in the middle ear, and that leads to a blockage in your eustachian tube, which will not be able to equalize pressure on either side, because remember, it's supposed to be fluid filled, but now if there's liquid in there, it's going to cause tremendous amount of pain, and you are not able to equalize pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane, and this may cause the tympanic membrane to burst, leading to hearing loss. Okay, please go over lots of past papers on this, because as you can see, it's similar kind of questions that come out in different scenarios. So if you go over past papers, you will be well prepared for your June exam. Okay, so sit tight. We're going to have a little break, and do not go. Radine will come back and tell you about the functions of the ear and the defects of the ear. So stay right where you are. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, grade 12s. Welcome back to our lesson today, our life sciences lesson. My name is Radine Kruger, and I'm going to carry on with the path of, or the functioning of the ear, which is hearing and then balance and equilibrium. Okay, so first of all, we're going to have a look at what we call the path of sound. And we start then obviously at the outer ear. And remember, we said the outer ear consists of the pinna, which is here, up until the tympanic membrane. And basically what happens is the pinna is what is the structure that captures the sound wave. So remember, it's the shape of the pinna is very nicely shaped, plus all those ridges inside. They then allow the sound then to be directed into our auditory canal, because those sound waves must go to the tympanic membrane. And then at the end of the auditory canal, we have our tympanic membrane, and that is like a drum. That's why we call it the eardrum. It's the same kind of membrane as a drum. So if you pat on a drum, it starts to vibrate. And that is what happens to the tympanic membrane. Now, those air waves that have come from outside into there, they then are converted by the tympanic membrane into vibration. So as soon as those airwaves strike the tympanic membrane, it starts to move, it starts to vibrate. And remember, Fauzi said to us that the three little ossicles that we find in the middle ear, they are attached. The first one, the hammer, is attached to the tympanic membrane. So when it starts to move like that, to vibrate, it causes the little hammer then to start vibrating. And that then vibrates against the next little bone, which is the anvil. And the anvil then also starts to move. And as that starts to move, so the vibrations then start moving through the ossicles until it reaches the third little bone, the stirrup or the stapes, and that also starts to vibrate. So the air waves now have been converted into vibrations. Okay, and so those vibrations then are in the middle ear, and then the last little ossicle, the stapes or the stirrup, is attached to another membrane, and that is called the oval window. And that, when that stirrup starts to vibrate, it causes the oval window membrane to also start moving. And remember, we said that in the inner ear, there that structure is slightly different. Instead of being filled with air, that structure is filled with liquid. So now we have a membrane that starts to vibrate, and inside of that we have liquid. And what happens is when we start pushing against the liquid, when that oval window starts to push against it, it starts causing waves in that oval window. So it's the same as if you sit in the bath and you move backwards and forwards, you start causing waves in that water. So that's what happens, is that liquid in the inner ear starts to move, and it forms pressure waves. Okay, so that is basically the path of sound. And then as soon as those liquid waves start to, they cause the membranes in the inner ear, in the cochlea, to start moving. And when those membranes move up and down, what happens is we've got one of the membranes is where the organ of Corti is situated. And when that membrane starts to move up and down, there's another membrane that it moves up against. And as soon as it moves up against that membrane, it causes the cells, the sensory or the receptor cells, to trigger an impulse. Okay, so the little hair cells, or the cells that form the organ of Corti, they then create a nervous impulse or an electrical impulse that is then carried via the auditory nerve to the brain. And here we need to know specifically, and you've learned the different parts of the brain, so you've already done that, and you remember that the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain, that is going to receive the impulses that come from the cochlea. So your cerebrum is going to pick up the sensation of hearing. Okay, and it's going to then tell you what it is you've heard, analyze that data, and then make sense of it. So the impulses that come from the organ of Corti, which is in the cochlea, will go to the cerebrum. They go via the auditory nerve to the cerebrum. Now, what we've done here is you can see we've just briefly mentioned each of the parts. So we started the first part is the pinna. That is what captures the sound waves. Then it travels down the auditory canal to the tympanic membrane. And you notice here that each of the first letters are highlighted in red. So the first part is the outer ear, which is pat. Okay, so you'll remember the three parts. Pinna, auditory canal, tympanic membrane. That is the path of sound in the outer ear. Then we get to the inner part, or the middle ear, and there we're going to find the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Those are your three little ossicles. So there we've got the next part of our little rhyme that we're going to say is MIS. And then from the middle ear, it goes into the inner ear, and it goes via the oval window and into the cochlea. Okay, so we say OC, and then to the organ of Corti that is then going to convert that pressure wave now into an impulse, and that gets carried via the auditory nerve to the cerebrum. Okay, and so we say pat, miss, OC, CAC. CAC if you want to. All right, but so hopefully that will remind you, if you learn that little rhyme, then maybe it will remind you of the exact path of sound through the ear. All right, now we're going to have a look at a slightly different diagram, and that shows the path of sound. So there we can see initially the sound waves come into the pinna, okay, in our outer ear. And can you see the amplitude of the sound waves? Okay, so that then travels via the auditory canal to the tympanic membrane. And once it reaches the ossicles, can you see what happens? So suddenly the amplitude increases. And remember, that is when Fauzi said to us that the tympanic membrane, because it's so much bigger than the oval window, and the little bones that get smaller and smaller, surface area gets smaller and smaller. So that is how the sound, so you can see how much it is amplified, and that's right through the middle ear, and then via the oval window into the cochleal fluid. And then once it reaches the organ of Corti, it now becomes what we call an impulse. Please don't call it a message. Okay, we won't give you any marks. If you write that in the exam, you will not get any marks. It must be called an impulse. You can call it a nerve impulse, or you can just call it an impulse. Okay, and that then, so those pressure waves. So you can see we had sound waves. We started off with sound waves, which then became vibrations in the middle ear, which then become pressure waves in the inner ear, and they are then converted into a nerve impulse. And remember, we said that nerve impulse is going to go to the cerebrum. Okay, so that part of the brain. So we need to be specific. Can't just say it goes to the brain. When we answer this kind of question in paper 1, the markers will also look for the term cerebrum. All right. Okay, so that's basically the path of sound, and that is how hearing happens. And then obviously in the brain, the sound, the impulse is then analyzed, and then you are then aware of what the sound is. Okay. All right, so now we're going to have a look at an activity quickly, and we're just going to answer some questions, and this comes off a past paper, and you'll see here, when we read questions from exams, we need to read them very carefully, because in this question, they ask us to write down the letter. So in other words, we're going to go to the diagram, and we're going to have a look at these letters here, the labels that are the letters that they've used to label the structure. And the first one is they ask us to write down only the letter of the part where sound is transmitted in the form of a pressure wave in liquid. Okay, so where did we say? We said on the outer ear, this was air-filled, so that has air in it. We said the middle ear has air in it, and we said the inner ear has liquid. So this is where the liquid is. So we're going to then, to answer that question, we're going to go and have a look at the labels or the letters that are here in the inner ear. Okay, and if we remember, this structure here is the nerve, so that isn't where the pressure wave is going to be, so it must be then in C. Okay, so we can very easily work out our answer. If we're not even sure of it, we can work it out by process of elimination. All right. And the next question is where the sound is transmitted in the form of an electrical impulse. So again, it's going to be in the inner ear, and there we said this was the nerve, so therefore it must be D that then is going to transmit the impulse. All right, okay, now the next question they ask us to explain the effect if the receptors in region C, so we need to have a look at region C there, are damaged. Okay, so now if the little receptor cells that we find in the organ of Corti are damaged, what is going to happen? Okay, so when damaged, the receptors cannot convert the stimulus, so they can't convert those pressure waves into an impulse. And so we don't have an impulse that's going, so there's no impulse, or there's fewer impulses are transmitted to the cerebrum, and because of that, the person doesn't hear anything, or hearing is impaired. Okay, so they may not be able to hear properly. All right. Then we're going to have a look at activity 6. We need to explain why fusion. Now, what does fusion mean? Okay, so remember when we said fusion is when structures join or melt or join up, become hardened and join together. And so, oopsie, I'm going too fast now. Let me go back. All right, so they're asking us to explain why. So we need to explain. It's an explain kind of question. So we can't just name. And they want to know fusion of the structures at B. Okay, so if we have a look at the structures at B, we know those are our 3 ossicles. This is number 1, that's number 2, and this is our 3rd one. So why would they lead to hearing loss? Okay, so remember we said their function is to transmit our waves as vibrations. So if they fuse together, so if we now have them all joined as one structure, then we're not going to get them to be able to vibrate properly against each other and then transmit that vibration across to the inner ear. Right, so the ossicles or the structures, it's actually at B, will not be able to vibrate and therefore the vibrations will not be passed to the inner ear. Okay, so we get no passing or transmission of the vibrations into our inner ear. And if that doesn't happen, so then if there's no vibrations or vibrations there, then we're going to have, then obviously the cochlea is not going to be stimulated and there won't be an impulse, and so they will not be hearing. All right, now what part of the brain, okay, and this is, they like this question because you need to know the difference, because just now when we do balance, you'll see that the electrical impulse or the nerve impulse is carried to another part of the brain. So they're very keen to ask this question. So anything to do with hearing and the cochlea, then they're going to say which part of the brain is going to receive the impulses, and that would be the cerebrum. Remember we said it's the largest part of your brain. Okay, so it's that part. All right, now we're going to have a look at balance. Okay, and if we have a look at this diagram here, and I hope you can see the structure, but this is a very nice little simple diagram of the inner ear. And the parts we're now going to be talking about is our semicircular canals. All right, and you can see they are at different angles. And if you have a look at each little semicircular canal, at the one end there's a little swollen or swelling or broadened section, and that is known as the ampulla. And then just below that we have the other parts of the vestibular apparatus, and that is called the utriculus and the sacculus, or the utricle and the saccule. All right, and they are the parts that then are responsible for balance. Okay, now there's two ways in which the inner ear regulates balance, and that is, the first one is if I'm playing soccer and I'm running on the soccer field and suddenly the ball goes that way and I have to quickly turn around and face that way, or then, so you can imagine when you're running, you're not running in a straight line, you're moving around all over. So your body needs, or your brain is going to, that you've got receptors that are going to pick up that your head is changing direction and speed, and so to actually maintain balance so you don't fall over. All right. And that first part, the change in direction and speed, is something that is it's a stimulus that is received by the receptor we call crista in the semicircular canals. Okay, and the crista is a singular. If we make it plural, when we talk about more than one, we just add an E. And they are found in the structure that we said specifically was that broadened section, the end of the semicircular canal, called the ampulla. Okay, so they are found then in the semicircular canal. And again, we've put a little mnemonic here to try and help you remember that, and we call it acids, or we said it's acids, and that is the ampulla, which contains cristae, are sensitive, or they are receptive to change in direction and speed of your head. So that is when they would be stimulated, and then your body would then would then obviously maintain balance. Okay. And then the second way in which the inner ear regulates balance is that we then also, there are receptors in your inner ear that are sensitive or receptive to the change in position of your head. If I look down or if I look up, whatever, I don't fall over. Okay, because it's those receptors that then, if I turn my head this way or that way or forward or whatever, I'm not actually going to fall over. And that is receptors that we find in your sacculus and utriculus, and that is known as the macula. And they, as I said, are found in the sacculus and utriculus. And there again is our little mnemonic, SUMP. So in the sacculus and utriculus, we find maculae, and they are sensitive to the position of your head in relation to gravity. Okay, so when you change your head's position, it changes in relation to gravity. All right, so when I turn my head like this, I don't just keep carrying on and fall on my head. Okay, I just stay like that. My body maintains the balance. All right, so those two, that's the two ways in which the inner ear regulates balance. And then, so both of those receptors then, once they are stimulated, they're going to convert the stimulus into an impulse, and they send it via the auditory nerve. So remember we said there were two parts to the auditory nerve, and there's a part that then is going to come from there, and it joins there, and then it now takes the impulse to the cerebellum. And you remember when we did the brain, that's the part, the section that is at the back of your head, and that is the part that is responsible for balance and equilibrium. So this is why examiners love these questions. Okay, so they're going to then probably ask you about where the impulse from your semicircular canals or your utriculus and sacculus, where would that impulse be carried to, which part of the brain? Okay, and again, you need to be specific. And here again, we've tried to teach you or help you remember, and we say bellum for cerebellum, sounds like balance. Okay, so then you remember that your balance impulses are going to go to your cerebellum. All right. Okay, so the impulse then travels via the auditory nerve to the cerebellum, and that then sends an impulse to the affected muscle. So in other words, when I turn my head like this, or I quickly spin around, I'm not going to fall over my muscles, keep my body position. Okay. All right, so now let's have a look at the structures in a little bit more detail. So have a look at the diagrams here, and there in this diagram at the top there you can see your semicircular canals, and at the base of each semicircular canal in the ampulla, or the little swelling, we find the structure. So here you can see the little swelling in the tube. Okay, so this is the tube, and there you see the little swelling. And basically what we have in there is, remember we said it was liquid filled. So we've got liquid in here. And that liquid then, when I move my head, it's like a very thick, or it's not runny like water. It's like a little bit more gel-like. So for those of you who know what nail polish is like, it's a little bit thick. So that liquid is like that. That liquid that we find in the tubes. So when I move my head, it doesn't just rush. It slowly moves, okay, because it's a thick gel. So when I move my head like that, and then you can see over here we have a whole lot of receptor cells, and they've got little hairs in them, and then they've got a little cap, a thick jelly cap. And so when I move my head, this liquid starts to move, and it causes, and in fact in this diagram here you can see it shows it this way, where my little jelly cap then now is bent over. And as soon as that happens, then it triggers an impulse in the little cells that are embedded in that jelly cap. And when that happens, that impulse is then going to go via the auditory nerve to the cerebellum. Okay, so the cristae, we said, are found inside the ampullae. And please note, when we put an E at the end of each of them, then we're talking about the plural. Okay, it's exactly the same thing. It's crista is one, cristae is many, ampulla is one, ampullae is many. Okay, so the cristae are found inside the ampullae, which we know are at the base of the semicircular canal. So we saw that there. And what happens is when there's a sudden change in speed and direction, it's then going to cause that liquid, which is called endolymph, but you only need to know it. If you have a look at the exam guideline, they expect you to know it as liquid. Within those semicircular canals, that starts to move. And remember I said it's a little bit thicker than water, so it doesn't run as quickly as water. It's a little bit thicker, so it moves a little bit slower. And as soon as that liquid starts to move, okay, it then stimulates the cristae. Okay, so then that little cap, that thick gel cap, then is bent. So as the fluid starts to move, it bends, and then that is going to stimulate your cristae, and then the cristae then convert the stimulus into a nerve impulse, okay, which is then sent to the cerebellum via the auditory nerve. All right, so that is the semicircular canals and the cristae. And what did we say they were? What was their function? So we just quickly go back and have a look. Sorry. Okay, remember it's acids. Okay, and they are sensitive to speed and direction. Okay, so when you are running around, when you're dancing, when you're moving, any kind of activity, okay, they would then be stimulated, and so that your body then maintains balance, so you don't fall over. All right. Okay, so let's have a look at the next structure. Okay, that's the sacculus and the utriculus, and inside of the sacculus and utriculus we found macula, or when we talk about more than one, maculae. Okay, now let's also have a look at the diagram. Okay, so there you can see in the part that's between the semicircular canals and the cochlea, and that's where we find the sacculus and utriculus, and we find our receptors, because that's what maculae are, they're receptors. We find them in there. And again, if you have a look at the membrane that lines those structures, they've got the little hair cells or the receptor cells, and again they're embedded in like a thick jelly, and then around them in the structure is fluid. Okay, so remember we we said that the inner ear is filled with fluid. So we have fluid here. And again, so when my head is upright, then the structures will be normal. And as soon as I move my head forward, can you see what happens to the position? So the force of gravity, and that's why we say in this case, it's the position of your head in relation to gravity. So what happens is when I move my head forward, again that fluid is going to move, and as well as that thick little jelly layer. And in that jelly layer, we find little stones, little calcified stones called otoliths. And what happens is when gravity pulls, they're also going to cause, can you see the little hairs there start to bend? And as soon as they bend like that, then an impulse is stimulated. Okay, so that's basically how they function. All right, so let's have a look. Again, we said the maculae are found inside the sacculus and utriculus, so they're in that part. And when the position of the head or the body changes, the gravitational pull changes. Okay, so as soon as I move my head, now my gravitational pull is different, because here, gravitational pull. Now, it's pulling here. Okay, so can you see it changes? Now, as soon as that happens, the maculae, which are my little receptors, they're going to convert the stimulus into a nerve impulse, and that nerve impulse goes via the auditory nerve and again to my cerebellum. Remember, cerebellum, balance. Okay, cerebellum then interprets that impulse and sends an impulse to the affected muscles so that when I lean forward like this, I don't carry on, keep falling, and I fall flat on my face. All right, so that then basically ensures that I have balance, or my balance and equilibrium are maintained. All right. Okay, so let's have a look at an activity based on these structures. Okay, so the first question they ask us is name the receptors that are found in part B. So I go and I have a look at my diagram and I can see part B is my semicircular canals. And we spoke about them having the different receptors in them. And so the name of those receptors obviously would be Christie. Okay, then they ask the next question, describe. Okay, so that's different to an explain. I don't need to explain why or whatever. I now just need to basically or simply describe what happens. So I'm going to describe the role of part B, which is this, in maintaining balance. So what I really need to just tell the examiner is how do the semicircular canals maintain balance. All right, so let's have a look at the answer. Okay, so the first thing we're going to write down is that the Christie, which are in the semicircular canals, are stimulated by changes in speed and direction, because that's what we said, of movement. And then the Christie, once they have been stimulated, they're going to convert the stimulus or the stimuli into nerve impulses. And those nerve impulses then are going to travel or are transported along the auditory nerve to the cerebellum to be interpreted. Okay, so can you see when they ask us a question like that, a describe question, very often it's for more than 2 marks, 2 or 3 marks. So sometimes it goes for 4, and even this one I would say could even be possibly 5 or 6 marks. Okay, so it must be a nice full description. And actually, when you have a look at it, you might have thought that's a little bit of a difficult question, but it's not, because you just mentioned all the structures. So the Christie, we said, the semicircular canals, what are they stimulated by? Speed and direction. What happens? The Christie then convert the stimuli into a nerve impulse. That nerve impulse doesn't stay there. It's got to move. Okay, and that then is transported along the auditory nerve, and that must then go to the cerebellum. Okay, so these questions are actually, when you look at them and you've practiced and you know this, then they actually become quite easy to answer. All right, let's have a look at the next activity. Okay, or the next question. It says, describe how the sacculus and utriculus in the human ear maintain balance in the human body. And again, so here we can see the marks are for 5 marks, and they ask, describe how and they've asked us sacculus and utriculus. So now we're not looking at the semicircular canals, we're now looking specifically at those. And so we're going to be looking at the maculae. Okay. All right, so let's see, what do they say is our answer. All right, so we said if it's the sacculus and utriculus, then it's the maculae that are found there. They are stimulated by the change in the position of the head. So the head has changed position somehow, and that then has caused, that is a stimulus. The position of the head changing is the stimulus, and that's then going to cause the maculae to convert that into a nerve impulse. So there we now have the stimulus that's converted into a nerve impulse. And as soon as that happens, that nerve impulse must be transmitted via the auditory nerve. And where does it go? Remember we said balance, cerebellum. So it goes to the cerebellum, which then also sends an impulse to our muscles so that my body, and I don't keep falling forward, that my body stays in position, but I can move my head, okay, and remain and maintain my balance. Okay, so that sends an impulse to the muscles, and that enables the person to maintain balance and body position. All right. Okay, now let's have a look at the diseases and the disorders of the ear. Okay, so very common, and I mean, when you were little, you might have complained often of earache. We talk about earache, so we find earache in little children quite frequently, but it can also affect us as we grow older. And as adults, we also get earache, and that can be for different reasons. Okay, and the first one, so we have a look here. Very often it's related to a middle ear infection. And what happens is, in the middle ear, and remember we said that it's air-filled, okay, but it has a mucous membrane that lines it. So what happens is, if little microorganisms, bacteria, virus, whatever, gets into the middle ear, because the eustachian tube opens in the back of our throat. So we can get infections that go into our middle ear. And what happens then is, if you have a look at this this diagram here, you can see, so here's an enlarged section of the middle ear. And what happens is the membrane now has been irritated by something has caused the irritation. It could be a microorganism, it could just be some particles, any kind of particles that we find in the air. And they actually irritate that membrane. And because that membrane is a mucous membrane, it's going to produce mucus. So what happens is the ear then becomes filled with liquid, with fluid. Okay, and then that can't always drain. And so what happens is the eustachian tube becomes quite inflamed and swollen. So there you can see the tube is swollen. And when it's swollen like that, it actually closes. So then the fluid can't actually drain through into the back of your throat. And then that fluid is going to accumulate, and it accumulates in your middle ear. Now remember we said, when we did the structure of the ear, we said that the pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane must be equal, and your body equalizes that pressure. Now from the outside, we've got air pressure, and if that eustachian tube is blocked and we've got fluid in there, it's building up pressure, plus we can't equalize the pressure because the eustachian tube is blocked. So what happens is the pressure builds up on the inside of the tympanic membrane, and as the pressure builds up, what it can do is it can cause the tympanic membrane to actually rupture, to burst. Okay, and then obviously that's going to affect your hearing. And I haven't had that, but apparently it's extremely painful. But that pressure buildup is what causes the middle ear to ache. Okay, and that's earache. So usually what we do, or what happens there, the treatment for that, for middle ear infection, is an antibiotic, which then usually clears up the infection. And so your mucous membrane goes back to normal, your little eustachian tube opens up again, and the pressure can equalize. And for those of you who have had middle ear infection, you know when you speak, it sounds, your ears are blocked and it sounds like you're talking from underwater or whatever. For yourself, it sounds strange. Okay, now if that is chronic, say for example, you have some kind of an allergy and it keeps causing middle ear infection. So that's chronic. And you have that chronic. So then what doctors do is they insert a little grommet, structure that we call a grommet. And I'll show you on the next slide. It's a little button-like structure. It's a tiny little plastic button that they put into your tympanic membrane. So they insert it in the tympanic membrane. Here you can see it inserted. And what it does is it has a little hollow tube, a hollow. So that allows any fluid then to drain. So it can't drain through your eustachian tube. So what it does is it can drain then from the inside, from your middle ear, from the inside of your tympanic membrane into your auditory canal. And it allows then your eustachian tube to recover, for the infection to clear up. It also equalizes or relieves the pressure buildup. And so, it's quite a good treatment for middle ear infection. And, it's quite a common thing in little children, as I said. And what happens is you don't have to go and have it removed. It eventually will just fall out. Okay, so it's quite a simple or, an easy thing or an easy fix for middle ear infection if it's chronic. Right, so those are grommets. Then the next thing we need to look at is possible causes of hearing loss. Okay, so, and there can be different causes. So this first one, if we have a look here, we see hardened earwax. So remember, Fauzi said that in our auditory canal, we have little glands which produce wax. And that's very important because it's a protection. It keeps the tympanic membrane moisturized. It also prevents anything from coming in, like insects or anything from making a nest in your ear because it's nice and warm and dark in there. Or also dust particles or anything like that, so it prevents that. But what can happen is your body or your ear produces, your auditory canal produces a lot of earwax and it builds up. So you have quite a build up and then that becomes dried out because the air is going to dry the wax out and it becomes hardened. And then you can see it's blocking the path of sound. Okay, so remember we said the sound must come in from outside and it must get to the tympanic membrane. So if it blocks that, then it's going to obviously affect the path of sound and you would then have difficulty in hearing. So what happens is then the doctor, they usually flush it out. So they use water or liquid under high pressure and then they flush it out. All right. Then other reasons for hearing loss can be for ruptured tympanic membrane. And here in these two diagrams you can see how obviously from the pressure, either from the outside, if you went diving and you didn't equalize, or you're in a plane and you didn't equalize, or just from middle ear infection, where the pressure builds up so much on one side of the tympanic membrane and it causes it to rupture. Other reasons can be damage to the ossicles, so those little bones that we find in the middle ear. If they become fused or whatever, then we're also going to have hearing loss. Also, the structure here, our cochlea, the hair cells, which are in the organ of Corti, they could also be damaged. And yeah, loud sounds causes them to become damaged, and you lose cells in your cochlea. And so you might know that as you get older, from the day you're born already, your hearing starts to become less and less. So that's why when you get older, like to my age, your hearing, you start becoming hard of hearing. It's because you've lost so many of those little receptor cells. And loud sounds is going to accelerate that damage. Then another cause could also be damage to the auditory nerve. So there might be some kind of damage that has happened there. Or otherwise, damage to the part of the brain that is going to interpret the data or the impulses that come from the ear, and that then may also cause hearing loss. All right. Okay, now the treatment we have different kinds of treatment. As I said, for middle ear infection, we had grommets. For hearing loss, we have different forms of aids in which to amplify or to improve or to increase our hearing. And that's, for example, hearing aids, and you get various different types. But you might have seen somebody that's got a little structure at the back of their ear that's situated there. It's this little part, and then that part goes into your auditory canal, and that then is going to amplify sound so that you can hear better. And then for those people who have, problems with the cochlea, so it's in the inner ear. Because remember, if I just put a little hearing aid into my outer ear, it's not really going to remedy what is wrong in the inner ear. So that's where we have a cochlear implant, and they implant a little electrode, which then stimulates, which helps to stimulate the cochlea, the cells there, and that then causes the stimulus then to be converted into an impulse, and then that would obviously be carried to the brain. Okay, so those are known as cochlear implants. All right, so now we're going to have a look at an activity, okay, based on the defects. So the first one is they're asking us to identify structure B. So we look at the diagram, and there we can see that's a nerve that is coming from both our vestibular apparatus or our semicircular canals and our cochlea. Okay, so that would then be our auditory nerve. Right, and then structure E over here, which is that membrane at the end of the auditory canal, which is our tympanic membrane. Right, then they say, which part of the brain will receive impulses from part C? Okay, it's again, it's a repeat, so then, and you can see how much examiners like that question, and that would be the cerebrum. Okay, now they say, describe how an increased production of mucus in the nose, let me just get this question. In the nose and throat may lead to the bursting of part E. Okay, so that was our eustachian tube that then will become blocked. And what happens there then is the mucus will block the opening to the eustachian tube, and air cannot leave or cannot enter or leave the middle ear to equalize pressure on both sides of the tympanic membrane, or it causes an imbalance in the pressure because we've got more pressure this side than that side, and that then can cause your tympanic membrane to burst, okay, structure E to burst. Or you could have said mucus may move through the eustachian tube to the middle ear, and the buildup of mucus causes pressure in the middle ear, pushing on the tympanic membrane of part E. All right. Okay, the next one, again, they've given us a diagram with labels, and they've asked us to name the receptors that are found in part B. Okay, and those are our semicircular canals. There you can see the little ampullae nicely, and in the ampullae we said it is the cristae. Okay, then they say the next question, explain the consequence to the human body if. So in other words, you need to explain what happens if part C is damaged, and that would be part C. Okay, so we now got to say what happens to the body if part C is damaged. So the first thing is then, obviously, impulses from the cochlea cannot be transmitted to the brain because the structure is damaged, which means that hearing cannot occur. And B, the second question, is what happens if part A becomes hardened. Okay, so that's our round window, which is below our oval window. So we said that the round window is the structure that allows pressure that builds up. So remember, there's going to be movement and pressure waves in here. And if I don't allow those pressure waves to eventually escape, if I don't have some kind of a pressure valve that allows those waves to escape, those waves are going to keep moving. Okay, and I'm going to hear echoing instead of hearing nice clear sounds. So now that structure becomes hardened. So in other words, it can't vibrate and allow the sound waves to dissipate or disappear. So that then is obviously going to, so it won't be able to vibrate or the round window will not be able to absorb the sound waves from the cochlea, and that's then going to obviously affect my hearing. Right. Okay, and that is all we have for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you've covered all of this in the exam, in the class, and that you are prepared for our exam that is being written on Tuesday. For those of you that are writing the provincial exam, and I wish you good luck. And remember, stay safe, keep social distance, keep your mask on, sanitize, because we'd really like you to see you be able to attend school, study, write your exams, and then complete your matric. Okay, thank you, grade 12s.